Friends, a very warm welcome to you from myself and from James as we seek to bring the word to life in conversation. And we're bringing, in particular, the gospel lectionary reading. And for this coming week, it's the last Sunday before Lent. And the passage is Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 36, which is Luke's account of the Transfiguration. So a very warm welcome if you're coming back again. Nice to see you. And if you're new, that's fantastic. A couple of things. We're very excited about the growing band of followers, aren't we, James?
We are. It's great to see that. And I know people are sharing it online and people are sending nice comments to us and helpful comments and good questions as well, I think.
Yeah, indeed. So, folks, don't be shy. Do share it with friends if you found this at all useful. And there's a button below which you can subscribe to, and at the end as well there'll be a subscribe button. So do come and join the merry band. James, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you very much, Ian. And just been thinking about some of the things we talked about last week, and you asked me about preaching and what had changed in my preaching and my preparation for preaching over the sort of 30 years or so that I've been preaching myself. And I thought, well, why shouldn't I ask that question right back at you? You're experienced preacher and come at it from perhaps a slightly different angle because you spend a lot of time in teaching ministry and in theological colleges and so on. I wonder what's changed for you in that time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think I've become conscious that there are three main elements to preaching as far as I see now. One is the engagement with the text and spending time immersed in the text, understanding what's there and what the dynamic and what the shape of it is. I think the second is then how do we connect what the text is saying with the congregation in front of us, particularly through the use of illustrations. And then the third part, which I suppose I've become much more conscious of in recent years, is the importance of good delivery, of the use of rhetoric, and of connecting and communicating in an effective way. And I guess what's changed over the years is, as you say, I've particularly been in a teaching context, teaching in theological college, and my work now is quite often spending time immersed in texts. So I find that the time delving into the text, I actually spend slightly less time in the sense that I can do things more efficiently. So I can actually work through a text, particularly a New Testament text, and work through it in Greek, make my own translation. I can actually do that much more quickly than I could when I began. I think I've noticed a change in my use of illustrations as well. I remember at the beginning of my preaching life, I think all of us, we sort of had to work really, really hard at finding dramatic and dynamic illustrations from sort of famous episodes and from things in history. I've actually found, I've come to the realization that the illustrations which really help people and connect are things from everyday life.
Yeah.
So I find myself sort of just dipping into the experience I've had in the previous week and things I've read or things I've come across which connect with some of the issues that I want to communicate. I think that on that third section, that's the area I spend more time now, which is thinking about delivery, thinking about the structure and the movement and the shape of what I'm preaching, and about how to say things with rhetorical impact, or how to move through the gears, how to use that sort of threefold framework, move from the logos and through the ethos to the pathos, so that we're actually saying something which has weight and power and conviction. So I think that's the changes for me.
Interesting, very interesting. Yeah, thank you. And of course, I mean, Jesus himself uses very simple illustrations, doesn't he, in his parables from everyday life. So yeah.
Oh, well, that's a good example to follow.
Yeah, it does seem to be, doesn't it?
Well, let's turn to the passage for this week.
Yeah.
So, and folks, if you're following, we're not putting text up on the screen just to save a bit of editing time. So you will need to have a Bible in front of you. It'll help if, as you listen. I've actually got my good old Throckmorton Gospel Parallels here to look at the passage. And it's really striking, again, looking at a synoptic parallel. Here's the Transfiguration, and you see some striking differences straight away. I was just, and of course we've written about this in yesterday's blog post, so again you can see all the written details there. But James, as I was going back and looking at this text again, I think I was struck with renewed force about the connections between this passage and what's immediately gone before. I know that was something that really struck you as well.
Yes, it is fascinating, isn't it, that the context here is that that confession of Peter that Jesus is the Messiah, he suddenly glimpsed who he is, and then Jesus immediately talks about his understanding of the journey of the Messiah, which involves suffering and death, and that's something which is really the very important background, I think, to this story of the Transfiguration.
Yeah, and what's striking is that you've got that tension already in the previous episode in the confession of Caesarea Philippi, but you have the tension here as well. And I was struck by the fact that all three of the synoptics retain, even though in previous weeks we've noticed how they've changed the order of things for their own purpose, all three of them actually hold these two episodes together.
Yeah.
And that seems to be very significant.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, one of these texts which scholarship has found very vexing immediately before this passage in Luke's version are, men, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And so some scholars have said, there we are. Jesus was an eschatological prophet who expected the end of the world to come in his lifetime, and he was disappointed, and the Jesus movement was coping with that disappointment. But it seems to me there's a much better explanation there, that Jesus says, you're going to see the kingdom of God, or interestingly, I was very struck by the fact that Mark says the kingdom of God with power. Normally it's the power language we find in Luke, or Matthew uses the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And then lo and behold, here we have the Transfiguration.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems, I mean, and I think the holding together of the story of the Transfiguration of Jesus' resurrection and the ascension, which we could come on to in a minute, seems to me to very much point to the fact that Jesus understood the kingdom to be coming in him and through those events and those actions, so that he takes Peter, James and John up the mountain. These are all three who will be there, as it were, at the inauguration of the mission of the church in the ascension story, and so on. So those things are very much held together. And I was fascinated, I'm sure you were too, about how we're told in the passage that two men appear alongside Jesus.
Yes.
And that's a phrase that Luke uses of those three events, and only of those three events: the Transfiguration, the resurrection, and the ascension. What do you make of that? Well,
it does seem to be. I mean, there's no need to suggest that these are the same two men, but there does seem to be that continuity. And I guess as well, for me, one of the background observations to make is that the presence of two witnesses is always key, because of the command in Deuteronomy, I think it's in Deuteronomy chapter 7, that you should not believe the testimony of anyone unless there is another witness who agrees. So in other words, two is always in the Gospels and the testimony. In Mark's account of Jesus' trial, Mark says very clearly they could find no two people who could agree in their accusations against Jesus. So again, that's just recognizing that that language of testimony and the need for two witnesses.
And I was struck also. I remember Steve Walton preaching once on this on one of these passages with this word "behold" in it, "idu" in Greek, and he says it's a good translation. We often translate it "look" or "behold" in the sort of King James, but actually "take notice" or is actually a very good translation of it. So this is something that Luke is almost telling the reader, the listener to the gospel. You need to notice this because this is important, and I'm telling you something through this. And so to have those three idus, those three take notices across those three events, seems to be very significant for the way Luke's inviting us to read the text. Yeah.
We'll go on a little diversion as well into Matthew's parallel in Matthew 16:28, just that introductory phrase, because Matthew says, Amen, I say to you, Jesus' words, some are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, I think you're aware, I've got a bit of a thing about the language of coming, Jesus coming. Well, in particular,
the direction,
the Son of Man coming in this kingdom, because again, all too often we read this is we get our knickers in a twist completely in Matthew 24, when Jesus says, and then you'll see the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds. And we're just in a habit, we're ingrained in interpreting that as the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven to earth, as if all that language is always about Jesus's return. When in fact, the language of Son of Man comes from Daniel 7, and in Daniel 7, the Son of Man comes on the clouds to the Ancient of Days. And I think I've convinced you that actually most often this language is about, it's not parousia language, it's not the Lord presence of Jesus coming, it's the coming of Jesus to the Ancient of Days. And therefore, as you said, it connects with the ascension, it connects with the outpouring of the Spirit. So we see the kingdom in power all the way through Acts as the Spirit is poured out, and as the disciples who have seen the transfigured Jesus now see him exalted to the right hand of the Father, the Spirit poured out, and then they see signs and wonders done through the Spirit. And this is the kingdom coming in power.
Yeah, absolutely. And if all that is true, then and the Transfiguration is the first of those three sort of kingdom indicators, if you like, then the fact that this story holds together very strongly that idea of the suffering of the Son of Man and the exaltation of the Son of Man seems to be something we should really think very carefully about. And it seems to be the thing that the disciples struggle with most in this passage, doesn't it? So,
and that just reminds me again of Peter's word at Pentecost, where he says, "This Jesus whom you crucified, God has exalted." And so again, you get the juxtaposition of the suffering and the rejection on the one hand, and then Jesus' exaltation on the other.
Yeah.
Now, I'm getting a little bit sort of geeky and obsessive here, but one thing I was really struck by is the time reference here. At the beginning of our passage, Luke 9:28, now about 8 days after these sayings, Mark mentions 6 days, I think, but or Matthew and Mark both mention 6 days, but of course that's the difference between inclusive and exclusive counting. So if we start, say, on a Sunday and we count Monday as day one, then 6 days later we get back to a Sunday. But if we count today as day one and the last day as the 8th day, then it's the same time. But I don't know. I don't know how I noticed this, but this is the only place, as I could find, in Matthew's Gospel where he actually specifies a very specific time period. And I guess
in Luke's Gospel, you mean?
No. Sorry, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say they specify the time period.
Yes, they do.
Now Luke does it several times, and Mark does it. This is the only time when Matthew does it. So I just feel as though this really emphasises the connection between
with the previous story.
But sorry, that is me getting a little bit sort of tech
geeky. Slightly geeky. Yeah.
But you'll forgive me that, I'm sure.
Yeah, we'll forgive you.
So let's look at the meat of the passage itself. Again, it's ironic, isn't it, that we're preaching on the transfiguration when the word transfigured is the one word that Luke omits. I'm not sure if Matthew talks about him being transfigured. Mark, in English versions, Mark says transfigured, but Luke simply says that the appearance of his face was altered, heteros. So I don't know if I've got a theory about why Luke omits that language. Do you?
No, I don't think I do. It must just be Luke's style. He likes to tell stories which are really quite vivid, as we've noticed in the previous passages we've looked at, haven't we? As we've been looking through Luke, he has a very dynamic narrative style.
I just thinking on the hoof. There's two possible issues for me here. One is that I actually think, and I've commented on other passages, the language of transfiguration is, I'm not sure how helpful that is. It actually comes from the Vulgate, the Latin translation. The Greek is metamorpheo, so changed. It seems to me that part of what Luke is doing here is he's actually slightly downplaying the fact that it's Jesus who's changed, and he's actually putting more emphasis on the change in understanding, or the development and understanding of the disciples. So I don't know whether the omitting of that word is just to focus us on the disciples' perception. The other interesting connection potentially is that his face being altered and shining makes a connection with Moses. So whether Luke is trying to just draw out the connection with Moses.
Yeah, that does seem to be quite significant, because obviously, people would only know that Moses' face as he came down the mountain was glowing with the divine presence, was that somebody told him. You can't see it yourself. There was no mirror. I'm glowing with the divine presence looking in the bathroom mirror. That's just not how it works. So that it's always got to be from the perception of those who were standing by, I guess. And I think Luke, who clearly, his story clearly depends on the eyewitness testimony of Peter, John, and James, or one of them at least. That's their perception of. So they're telling him what they saw, which is an interesting.
And just again, jumping another parallel, there is interestingly a connection between this and, as it were, you mentioned Peter's eyewitness testimony, and we actually find an account of the Transfiguration in 2 Peter.
In 2 Peter, yeah.
Although I haven't explored that much on the blog, and I don't know whether you've dipped into that.
No, I haven't much. I mean, I always think it's a fascinating to read that in the epistles, because they don't often refer directly to incidents in the life of Jesus other than the cross and resurrection. But it's very striking, I think, in 2 Peter that you get that, and I find it immensely reassuring, actually, that when you do read it, that this man really knew, he really knew the Lord. In person, as it were, and is perfectly happy just to give testimony to it in his writing.
And we will neatly sidestep those academic questions about the authorship and data.
Indeed.
That's for another episode.
Another time. Yeah.
Just notice on this connection that Luke's making. I also noted that in the blog post that you've got the connection with Luke, Moses' face shining. You've also got the connection with the fact that Moses also took 3 people up the mountain with him, and also that in Exodus 24, Moses hears there's a cloud overshadowing, then he hears the voice from the clouds. Some clearly some connections there. Sorry, you were going to come back on that.
I was just going to say, and I think one of the interesting things about Moses and Elijah being the 2 who are alongside Jesus is something to do with the fact that their lives are shaped, their godly lives are shaped in a way which we now discover Jesus's godly life is also shaped. So they both endured considerable suffering for their faithfulness to God, and that's something which is, I don't think that's insignificant in the fact. I know people say, well, you have Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, and that sort of thing. But actually, just think about the shape of their lives. That is something that is echoed in the life of Jesus, and to which this episode seems to be pointing. That it's not all, it's not all about triumph and vindication. Actually, there's a lot of water to go under the bridge before you get there.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the law and the prophets. That I think until actually looking at this passage carefully myself, that's the thing I'd always been told, that here you have the reason why you've got Moses and Elijah, you've got the law and the prophets. And in fact, in quite a lot of artistic depictions in this scene, which I think I've used on the blog, I might not use in relation to this video, is that Moses is holding the 2 tablets of the 10 commandments. Now, the problem with that is, number one, Moses is talked about as a prophet, and Jesus as a prophet like Moses. And the other is that, of course, Elijah was not one of the writing prophets. If it had been Moses and Isaiah, perhaps, then that might have worked. But it seemed to me that we need to look very carefully at Jewish traditions around Moses and Elijah. And obviously, the most obvious one is the tradition of Elijah being taken up into heaven on the chariot of fire, after which an excellent film was named. But also the fact that there's some mystery in Deuteronomy 34 about the end of Moses' life on Mount Nebo, and there's this really curious text which says, "And no one knows where he was buried." So that you can't pay homage to the shrine because it's not there. And again, this tradition that Moses, like Elijah, was a deathless one who was taken up into the presence of God.
And I've always found that more convincing, actually.
Oh, have you? Oh, right. Okay. Oh, good. So Jesus is the one here who the anticipation is that he's the one who will conquer death. Now here's the other fascinating thing we've got. This is going back to our parallels. So in Throckmorton, this is you can see in the passage here, this is the section where Luke has this extra bit which Matthew and Mark don't at all. And there's 2 really interesting parts to it. And I wonder whether that actually confirms some of the things we were saying earlier, because on the one hand, you have a bit of the conversation, which is really, I found intriguing, the conversation between Jesus and Moses and Elijah, talking about the exodus which he will accomplish at Jerusalem. And of course, you then have the reference to the disciples being sleepy and asleep, which I think also connects through with Gethsemane and the later episodes in Luke's Gospel.
Yes, and absolutely. The link with Gethsemane is a really interesting one, isn't it? And I think it's Philip Seddon, who I think on one of your old blogs, somebody says that he has this wonderful phrase that this is the photographic negative of Gethsemane, with the disciples sleeping in the context of the prayerfulness of Jesus. So that does seem to be something very much in the mind of Luke, that he's connecting that for us. And of course, that once again emphasizes the suffering of Jesus, which is right to the fore and intense in Gethsemane.
And this phrase, the exodus that he will accomplish at Jerusalem, again, that's a distinctive Lucan focus. And again, it's connecting Jesus back with Moses, with the exodus and the deliverance. It also connects back, I think, with the expectations in the Benedictus from chapter 1, where Zechariah is looking for the deliverance of Israel, where Simeon and Anna are looking for the consolation of Israel. And it also confirms Luke's really serious focus on Jerusalem again. So Jerusalem is the place where Jesus comes to. Jerusalem is where people are waiting faithfully in expectation. Jerusalem is where, you know, those final events happen. And of course, it's from Jerusalem that Jesus ascends in Luke's account.
Yeah, absolutely. Mentioned in all they either take place there or they're mentioned, and that Jerusalem link is once again, I think, you know, conclusive, really.
Yeah. Poor old Peter gets a bit of a bad rap here. They sort of startled. Well, now we know why they're so startled. According to Luke, they've actually fallen asleep. So they sort of think, "Oh my goodness, what's going on here?" Do you find a convincing explanation for why Peter blurts out this stuff about let's building shelters? Is it that he wants to capture the moment? Is there something else going on?
Yes, it's very difficult. I mean, I think in the blog you mentioned that the link with the Midrash of Psalm 24 and so on. I've not gone down that route previously. I've always felt that Peter he's already said just before this, you know, he's recognized Jesus as the Messiah. He's now confronted by as it were more of the story, and I think he jumps to the end of the story in a sense, Jesus' vindication, where we all need somewhere to dwell, before he gets to the end of the story. So I think what's happening here is he's understood the end, but he hasn't realized what has to happen between now and the end of the story. And so he's jumping to the end of it. It's a bit like when you open a book and you're halfway through and you think, okay, just kind of beginning to get it. And then you read the last page because you can't take the tension any longer. You know, you want to know the end. And I think Peter's a bit like that. And that does fit with the character we know of him in the Gospels, that he wants to jump to the end always. And that seems to me, I mean, that's quite a kind of human, recognizable thing that may be going on here. And that seems to me to connect with what's happening with Peter. There may be other stuff going on, but that's not something that that's the approach that I've taken in the past. I don't know what you think about that, but
yeah, I do. I mean, is there any kind of Johannine connection here, just because of using the language of tense, skene? Of course, Jesus's pictures tent amongst us. I'm not sure. I've not really explored that. One thing I just keep coming back to as well, and this is the much more general point, which is that it's a reminder that the Gospels do not offer a very flattering portrait of the. You know, in the book of Revelation, the apostles and the prophets are the foundation of the holy city, you know, and Paul in Ephesians talks about the apostles and prophets and so on. And you think for people founding this new dynamic global world-changing movement, I mean, it's a bit of a rocky foundation, really, and they are very human. And for me, it does come back to the general point of saying, you know, for people who question the authenticity or the reliability of the gospel accounts and say they were later constructions fabricated in order to explain the growth of this movement, I just think, do you know what? They could have done a lot better job. I mean, if I was doing this, if I were the later apostles trying to explain the origins of this movement, I think I'd have portrayed myself in a much better light.
I've given myself a much better press. Yeah,
you'd have to be incredibly sophisticated to say, well, people are going to question whether these are genuine. Therefore, I better make us look bad, so that in 20 centuries' time, people will say, "Oh, look, they don't do a very good job of it." That doesn't seem.
It just doesn't add up. No, it really doesn't.
Just a final observation, I think, from me on about the text, which is about clouds.
Yes.
Living in Britain and living in, well, actually, this
cloudy Britain,
Storm Eunice, and lots of clouds in the sky.
Yeah.
It does make me laugh when we see clouds, and most of us in Britain think, clouds? Yeah, so what? Big deal. But of course, actually, if you live in a bit of a better part of the world, or if you live in the Near East, people call it Middle East, Near East, then basically you get blue skies for a lot of the year, and so clouds are really significant. And of course, I did do a little word search, and just another little geeky thing here. It's really interesting just to do a word search in the New Testament of clouds and when clouds appear, and actually all through the scriptures. And of course, clouds signify the presence of God. So that's the significance here in the account.
Yes, and you kind of get this welding together of the divine glory that Moses glimpses and Jesus' divine glory as well. So it's once again, it absolutely tallies with what the voice from heaven says. You know, this is my son, the beloved. Yeah,
and not an allusion to the Transfiguration, but certainly bringing together those two themes we find at the beginning of 2 Corinthians, Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, or second letter we have, where again he draws that parallel with Moses having his face covered with a veil, but we without veiled face, we see the Lord's glory. And we are transformed. Actually, it uses that language, interestingly.
Yes. It's a wonderfully beautiful passage.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is. And again, the juxtaposition for Paul, with we see the glory, but we have this treasure in jars of clay, because actually, just as Jesus was glorified through the path of suffering, so we too actually have the glory. We see the glory of Jesus, of God in Jesus, and we live lives of suffering. Paul then goes on to talk about all the things he struggled with.
Yeah.
I just want to finish, James, by we're coming into land here, as they say. I found this whole process, going back to the point we had at the very beginning of the connection between Peter's experience of recognizing who Jesus is, Jesus responding with the language of the Son of Man suffering, yes. And then right next to that, we get the language of transfiguration and glory and seeing the kingdom in power and holding those two things together. And I guess the challenge of the juxtaposition, but also the challenge of, as disciples, holding together all the different dimensions of who Jesus is and what it means to follow him. I can't remember if you saw it, but a little while ago, I wrote a post about choosing your own personal Jesus. And I said, oh, are you a charismatic? Great, Jesus is a wonder worker. Are you a liberal? Great, Jesus is a social transformer. Are you a conservative? Great, Jesus is, honing on the scriptures and so on. And just the way that in contemporary conversation, it's all too easy for us to take one part of who Jesus is, and the bits that we like, and leave out the bits that we find awkward or challenging, or the bits we don't like. And the dynamic here seems to speak into that quite powerfully.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think the other thing that strikes me about this is that worship is really important. I mean, Peter and the disciples are really being called to worship, aren't they? And once we worship in the context of our own suffering and walking the way of Christ, that is the thing that is transformative for us, and that's vital. We grasp that. Otherwise, we'll end up in a depressive heap, and that when we are suffering and going through really difficult times in our Christian lives, worship is more important than ever, because we need to be transformed by that in the context of the worship of the whole church. It seems to me. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we'll close there. James, thank you very much for joining me again. Folks, friends, thank you very much for joining us. Don't forget, you can subscribe. There's a button just here, and just coming over James's phrase. Sorry about that, James, again. You can look at last week's video as well, or you can just have a little click and look through the whole series. But do subscribe here, and do share this, do pass it on to others. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
Yes. Goodbye.